Father Gabriel Pravarnik. I'm the director here for the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies. And it's my great pleasure to make history today. I don't know if it'll be a history that we like. I'm sure it will be. I'm totally kidding. I'm very happy to welcome Father James Sabak, Franciscan, not only here to the college, but indeed to the center now for this inaugural talk of what will become, I think, a series of talks on Catholic heritage that the center can offer on various traditions, not just the Dominicans. Father Jim makes ground, or in some sense makes history, by being the first Franciscan friar to ever teach at the college. This will be his first and hopefully not his last semester here. In the interest of being above board and completely transparent, Father Jim and I go way back. 16 years now, I think we've known each other, and which means he knows where all the skeletons have been buried. So you are not allowed to talk to him. You may not ask him any questions, and you are not allowed to say anything about me. Father Sabak is an assistant professor now in our Department of Theology. His specialty is in my area as well, sacraments and liturgy, and has just finished his work at the Catholic University of America, where he did a dissertation looking at the preface prayers in relation to vigils, or all the prayers, in relation to vigils, and especially how those relate, I believe, to the new missal. So please join me in welcoming Father Jim Sabak.
Thank you, Father Gabriel. I feel as though I should begin this talk that I'm going to give a la what Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate, his running mate, did in 1992 in the debate that Admiral James Stockdale had with Dan Quayle and Al Gore. If you remember that debate, he begins it by saying, "Who am I? Why am I here?" And I think it's a good question to ask, because if anybody who's been really acquainted with anything Franciscan might generally come to understand or come to know, when one thinks of Franciscans, one thinks of peace, love, ecology, all those wonderful good things, but one rarely often thinks of Franciscans and education. Even though there is a school that is 3 hours away from here and another school that is 8 hours away from here, Franciscans and education might seem a little bit of an oxymoron sometimes to some people who are acquainted with kind of one aspect or one ideal of what Franciscans are. The truth is that sometimes contemporary perceptions of Franciscans do not easily harmonize education and the Franciscan tradition or the Franciscan movement. And for some times we have been depicted as anything, we Franciscans have been depicted as anything but academically inclined. Evidence for such perceptions can be found sometimes, I think, in references to the famous or infamous, depending on who you are talking to, cartoon called Brother Juniper. I don't know if you ever saw that before. But it's a cartoon that ran in newspapers from 1958 to about 1989, and it was depicting a happy, little rotund Franciscan engaged in all types of cute, silly, and humorous antics. One of the most famous is a little picture of him trying to ring a bell on a rope, and he gets carried away with it, and all it is a bunch of him going, wee, wee. Lovable for sure, but that kind of image of Brother Juniper sort of depicts a rather naive and unsophisticated worldview, which can be beautiful to some, but kind of masks a whole other aspect, perhaps, of what it means to be Franciscan. And unless, I think, one reads Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, one might miss there a very sarcastic and perhaps accurate description of Franciscan friars. It comes at the point, if you've ever read Dickens' A Christmas Carol, in which Scrooge has been visited by the ghost of Christmas Present. And the ghost of Christmas Present leads him into London on Christmas morning. And they pass by a grocer's market. And here Dickens describes some of the produce that can be found in this market on Christmas Day. One thing that he describes is, and I quote, "There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions," Dickens writes, "shining in their fatness of their growth like Spanish friars." I want to be on the record in saying that I am not Spanish. I am just girth. But I also believe that Dickens was certainly not describing the sons of Dominic. And how do I know that Dickens is not doing this? Because the only building that is left standing from the medieval Franciscan House of Studies at the University of Paris, the Grand Couvent des Cordeliers, is the refectory, the dining room. Go figure. Perhaps Dickens was only reflecting the current status of Franciscan concerns in academia at his time. These, and perhaps countless other examples, have contributed to the view of the Order of Friars Minor, OFM, as an order of either old or outrageous fat men, good for a laugh, a joke, a beer, a beef dinner, but not really capable of contributing perhaps to the rigors of academic discourse. Such is the state of affairs at times that it has prompted one Franciscan friar currently, who himself has a doctoral degree, to conclude, well, yes, Franciscans are involved greatly in education, but we really don't know what we're doing there. It's not a very affirming statement, perhaps, for anybody who wants to go into education, perhaps as a Franciscan, particularly when education can cost, in the doctoral range, up to perhaps 6 figures before the decimal point. So many Franciscans, it seems concurrently or contemporarily, pursue scholarly study, pursue education, often with suspicion among other Franciscans. Because the idea is sometimes there that you as a scholar, you as a student, are not involved in the hard ministry that Franciscans are called to care for the poor, to care for the marginalized, to work among the people, to work in the marketplaces, to help evangelization continue and to move forward. And so therefore, friars who may set out to study and move into the rigors of study often do so almost in secret. They don't want anyone else to know, or they do it under cloak of darkness, lest they be found out. And those who are found out at times must go ahead and prepare a watertight apologia for doing so. And this seems, again, because this pursuit of education seems to affront the very notions of poverty and simplicity of life, which is the one thing that everyone, it seems, friar and not, is an authority on. The problem that results, perhaps, with this sort of state of affairs in understanding Franciscans and their role in education stems really from Francis's own suspicion over education itself. And basically that can be a very warranted conclusion determined from the answer that St. Francis gives to St. Anthony when Anthony inquires about teaching the friars to be better able to respond to the challenging teachings of the Albigensians and other perhaps counter-Orthodox thinkers in the 12th and 13th centuries. Francis responds to Anthony, perhaps in a well-known quote, mostly among friars, Franciscan friars, but maybe among others, that says, basically, go ahead and teach them, but make sure that what you teach them does not extinguish the spirit of prayer and devotion among the friars. A very noble, a very important, perhaps a caution that Francis gives. But yet, it's at times been interpreted that Francis would like to have basically friars who are very prayerful, are very devout, but maybe are not very learned. And it could lead some to deduce that basically a good Franciscan friar is a dumb Franciscan friar. And the more that they don't think, the more that they are able then to do work and be told to do the work that they need to do, and to further the cause of evangelization within the church. Giles of Assisi, one of Francis's initial companions, is famously noted for his lament, "O Paris, thou hast destroyed Assisi," again, when the friars moved to the University of Paris. Giles was also known for being a tad bit overly dramatic. And so how is it seems, that with all these many hindrances to a Franciscan embrace of education, that this particular Franciscan has found himself wandering into this Dominican college? Some might see it as a novelty act. It's always good to have a Franciscan around. I could be seen perhaps as the royal peculiar that Westminster Abbey is in England. Again, it is a monastery that was Benedictine that is now owned by the British Crown. Except that the term royal peculiar is coined from the Latin peculiaris, which means private property, as the abbey is the private property of the British Crown. Here, I could just be seen as peculiar. Because there are also perhaps some strains that accepting a Franciscan onto the campus of a Dominican college might cause or might sustain. For one, in its reality and its truth, I represent a branch of theological understanding that did not win the favor of papal countenance in the late Middle Ages. I am technically a Scotist in my theological outlook and not a Thomist. What is the difference? I don't know. But basically, if we were living in the Middle Ages, it would be very severe. Much of it basically maybe had to do with whether or not humanity was created in grace or it's something that happened afterwards, whether or not the incarnation, God becoming flesh in Christ, would have happened with or without the incident in the Garden of Eden. And the big thing is whether Mary was immaculate at her conception or not. Franciscans believed that she was and fought for that. The Dominicans did not. However, if you asked a Franciscan today, he would say, what? I don't think she was. No, again, the idea, again, is that these issues were brought out from conversations that happened at the time. But still, coming from a different sort of perception on theology might cause a little bit of tension. This tension could also then help, unfortunately, to remind my Dominican brothers of the fact that it results from basically a challenge, some might also call it an attack, of a Franciscan John of Peckham on the posterity of Thomas Aquinas, whom he did not believe was correct in Aquinas' understanding of unity of form. Again, something I couldn't explain to you if you asked me. It leads, however, to the understanding of John Duns Scotus, the Franciscan who began this Scotistic way of understanding theology, and it sort of caused a wedge to develop between the Dominican movement and the Franciscan movement. But before all of this unpleasantness, in truth, the initial history of Dominican and Franciscan scholarship was tightly entwined in the Middle Ages. The Dominican model, in fact, was the foundation for every mendicant's approach to education. Mendicants, those men of religious conviction who tried to further a reform, not just in the understanding of what it meant to be church in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, but also in the way that one accessed knowledge and information in those areas. The Dominicans led the way in the Middle Ages in the establishment of faculties of theology based on a deeper study of the elements of theology that went beyond what Scripture alone can provide, which was basically the source for most of theological study and education before that time. The Franciscans, when they came to the University of Paris, especially in the 13th century, found the Dominicans already there and were guided by their approach in establishing houses of studies for their students. In fact, the advent of the friars, both Franciscan and Dominican, and even the later order of Carmelites, into the University of Paris in the 13th century, brought great opposition to the Mendicant movement, to the Mendicant ways of teaching, by non-Mendicant scholars, by the secular scholars at the University of Paris. So much so that many of the Mendicants, Franciscan and Dominican, were accused of stealing away the secular scholars' students, and even worse, making them desirous of entering either order. That is something I have been told expressly I am not to do. I cannot take any of the students away from anyone who has a Dominican vocation and make it a Franciscan vocation. It would be very bad form here on this campus. But it's interesting that so much was the tension in the 13th century in Paris that it became dangerous for any friar to appear in the streets, it is told. And that in a letter of the Dominican Master General in 1245 basically complains that when a friar is seen in the streets of Paris, dogs bark, bears growl, and serpents hiss. All that Father Macriche has said is that when he sees me walking by a bunch of squirrels, they salute. There were also many scurrilous songs created, particularly about the bad teaching practices of the Franciscans, which can be summed up by the idea that a Franciscan couldn't teach his way out of a paper bag. And so, while a lesser informed Catholic, when considering Catholic higher education, may only consider a certain religious community, one with a school about an hour north of here, they can be gently reminded that long before that community ever came on the scene or into existence, the Mendicant orders provided leadership and education in the academic enterprise. For this reason, there were many scholars who today believe that Francis never really condemned learning, but rather that he was very cautious about it developing within the order. Why? Well, perhaps for one simple reason: education itself can become a terrible source of pride. And yet what happens within the Mendicant movement and setting up their own houses of learning in the university systems, the struggles that were suffered by the secular scholars, non-religious, secular scholars meaning those scholars not attached to religious communities, they had to find a benefice, somebody to support them in their education. They had to worry about repaying their debts to patrons. They had to then take on expectations of a career and higher levels of church or state. All of these concerns, a race for preferment that many of the secular scholars had to weather and had to struggle through, all of that was not a part of the friars' educational background. They were free from the pressures of secular ambition and did not have to concern themselves with it. In fact, without having to be owing to anyone, the friars, all the Mendicants together, could pursue original intellectual work. Mendicant scholarship would approach learning also then from a very different angle. from the Dominican Humberto Roman, who said that study is not the end of the Dominican order, but necessary to secure its end, preaching and the salvation of souls, to the Franciscan Bonaventure Bagnaregio, who understood that all knowledge must ultimately lead to God. The teaching of the friars, both Dominican and Franciscan, was concerned not only with attainment of degrees and distinction, but more importantly with forming friars for their future roles as pastors and as leaders within the church. To this, then, what is the Franciscan contribution, perhaps in and of itself? Well, many people can take a look at various different Franciscan scholars in the Middle Ages, and can, unfortunately, after the Reformation, Franciscan scholarship kind of it becomes muted. It sort of deadens itself. But in the power that existed within Franciscan education in the Middle Ages, one can sort of sum up the pursuit of Franciscans in academia as the idea that one cannot be successful in the pursuit of knowledge unless one also has faith. It has to do, I think, with the role of balance. The idea, the way to balance ideas needs a broader scope, a broader understanding of just what is involved with the establishment and the contribution of these ideas. Even today, in a world that seems very much at extremes and at odds with each other, even with the best of intentions, to be at extremes seems too much and too dangerous to be able to support any kind of education itself. The issue, though, is that within the Franciscan order itself, why it also struggles to sort of embrace its educational background or its educational heritage, is that Franciscans did not learn from this approach of balanced approaches to faith, balanced approaches to education in light of faith. Because for the Franciscans themselves, very soon, really even after Francis's death, divisions begin to appear within the order. Divisions that continue to grow and grow and grow, and really on the eve of the Reformation is when the order begins to split in two, into the observant movement, which I'm a part of, and then to the conventual movement, which are basically those friars who dress in black. We changed colors. But again, the idea, does one really work within the marketplace? Does one work among the people as the observants we're holding true to? Or does one sort of adopt a more resigned, kind of cloistered mentality to be able to further perhaps more work in education and understanding in academia? Neither division, any of the divisions that have then proceeded from that period of the 16th century, was desired by Francis, nor can it ever be celebrated as a blessing or as a part of the original intention of the Franciscan movement. This division, perhaps within the Franciscan movement from its beginning, it really seems to have harmed the intellectual pursuit of Franciscans as they began to war within themselves. Not necessarily over theological ideas, but over and again whether intellectual study was compatible with poverty. These divisions mark the reality that the Franciscan movement itself has to be seen as a divided movement. Even though it preaches peace and it preaches understanding, it preaches respect towards others, it is itself still an order that cannot seem to come together at times. Even today, there are still those Franciscans who, as members of the various colors of the Franciscan movement, will say that they are the origin, that they are the original friars. And sometimes there's competition for who was the original Franciscans or who's part of the original community. And so you get, we're the real Franciscans, no, we're the real Franciscans, no, we're the real Franciscans. It's like, I'm Spartacus, no, I'm Spartacus, no, I'm Spartacus, except there's no unanimity of purpose, in moving forward as there was, there. And so, in many ways, while it may be presumptuous of me to say this, I think that in the end, the internal wars that were experienced by the sons of St. Francis may have significantly hampered the furthering of the intellectual tradition, not just perhaps even of them, but in some ways it may have also harmed the intellectual tradition of the whole Mendicant movement. Perhaps, in many ways, now is the time to start to reclaim it with what is happening here on this campus. Because the Franciscan intellectual tradition in and of itself basically embraces, 5 different elements that are so very important, I think, to trying to understand, again, not just what makes, a university reflective of a particular religious community, but also what makes a particular college or university reflective of what it maybe means to be also Catholic. The first thing, basically, the Franciscan intellectual tradition contributes to the study of any science, of anything, is basically the idea, again, that we as human beings are created in this image of God. And so we are charged, basically, in many ways, to sort of continue this recreation that God is doing in this plan of fulfillment that God began from the beginning of time. We are not called to be passive bystanders. We're not called to be people who sit on the sidelines. We're not called to be people who watch the parade pass by. But this idea that to learn to know requires a doing, an investment, an investigation and discovery. And that because that is what makes God happy, many of the Franciscan early scholars believed. And for us to contribute to that furthers this goal of participating in the plan of salvation. The other element, perhaps, is this understanding that we discover, basically, what is a part of us in our intellectual endeavors. One of the big things, again, with Francis's life was that the world was kin. Everything was made through, for, and in the Word. And when the Word itself becomes incarnate, it is able then to share in everything that has been created in and for and through it. To see what we discover, not basically through a dispassionate lens or through an indifferent lens, but as something that kind of reflects who and what we are as the discoverers and the inquirers, in many ways helps us to appreciate more, perhaps, what it is that we discover and what it is that we investigate. The one large thing in Franciscan intellectual understanding, perhaps, again, which is, again, none of these are necessarily limited just to the Franciscan movement. They have been sort of, though, communicated in different ways by the movement. But the third is that basically community is divine. As much as we might not like each other from time to time, as much as we might have struggles and debates and challenges that we experience with each other, the fact that we are brought together is perhaps not just an action of our own volition and our own will, but the Franciscan tradition understood it as something that is led by something greater than ourselves. The idea that community is divine is something very countercultural, particularly within the United States, within the modern world itself, in which rugged individualism seems to constantly rule the day, or constantly be this idea that is carried forth. The Trinitarian aspect of the Franciscan understanding, of the Franciscan ideal, is made practical and visible when we can see it in those who gather together, and those who struggle together to try to understand, to learn, to accomplish the greater learning, the greater knowing that we can do as human beings. The fourth thing, basically, is this whole idea of stop putting sin at the center of everything. Because at the center of everything, Franciscan tradition says, is Christ. And yet we as human people, perhaps sort of influenced, by an inappropriate understanding of Puritan ideals, have placed too many times sin as being the whole crux upon which everything revolves. That does great damage, to what it means to be a believer in the world, or what it means to understand God's purpose or God's role in the world, or even why Christ came. Creation is Christocentric. Incarnation offers us meaning from our brokenness. It is not meant to be motivated by it. And so that whole idea is that if with or without a fall, the incarnation is a part of God's plan, is something, again, held very dear in the Franciscan movement. The last thing, again, is this whole idea of poverty. It's sort of an idea within the Franciscan tradition that has sometimes been overworked, to extents that are perhaps based more upon personal agendas and personal brokenness than it is upon an idea of a sort of grasping the fullness of what this vow means for religious community. Because poverty is not necessarily seen as a giving away. In the truth of the Franciscan movement, poverty was always seen, basically, first and foremost, as an act of generosity. An act of generosity in the image of a generous God, to whom all reality belongs. It's the understanding of appreciating everything as gift. And so you don't hold on to it. You don't own it. You don't try to control it. You don't try to manipulate it. You don't try to use it in ways that basically destroy the great image of gift that it is from God. The heart of Franciscan economics has always been to recognize gift and gift and gift again, and to become a part of the gift in our very selves, and how much we give of ourselves. Not just basically in giving away, but having the courage to step out, perhaps from issues or places and ideals that we seem most comfortable with, to be challenged by something new, and be challenged by something different. In many ways, these five images, the image of God, the world as kin, community as divine, placing Christ at the center of everything, and seeing poverty as gift, in many ways, again, helps to sort of recreate or refocus the pursuit of knowledge. Because again, if Francis was cautious about knowledge becoming prideful, in that idea of this is what I own, this is what I know, this is what is mine, and I'm going to hold on to it and defend it at all costs, basically knowledge is then not seen as something that is gained, but knowledge is really the whole path of discovery. It is discovery again and again that moves one deeper and deeper into appreciating not just how much we don't know, but how much more liberating and exhilarating it is when we recognize how much there is to know. This has always been a motivating force for the Mendicant scholar, I believe, and what made possible the great inroads the medieval friar scholars were able to make in the 13th and the 14th centuries. So in many ways, why has this Franciscan wandered into a Dominican college? Perhaps in some ways it is to reclaim some of these fundamental elements of mendicant intellectual pursuit. Something perhaps which we might not have ever really, not have thought about enough in this contemporary world. And the importance of mendicant intellectual pursuit is that it is always something that cannot be done alone or in isolation, whether that be in the isolation of a particularly Franciscan or Dominican school, or even alone perhaps in a university that is led by another tradition. The mendicant intellectual pursuit, the mendicant intellectual tradition basically necessitates the joining of all of ourselves together, especially perhaps joining today a Franciscan with Dominicans and those who accept and receive the Dominican tradition in forging of new discoveries that basically, again, help us to appreciate what it means not just to accomplish in learning, but what it means to learn in general, what it means to know in general. I hope that my presence here on this campus, again, contributes and adds to the great goal of what is Providence College in this pursuit of truth, in the pursuit of mother of all truth, that helps basically to enrich our future as human beings, that we find God the more that we dare to realize that in our discovery, it's not just us moving forward, but it's also something greater than ourselves helping us and initiating that movement to begin with. To join together in this great pursuit of mendicant intellectual tradition, maybe that will enable all of us to discover God in many more unexpected places in our world today, so that might be able to help to foster a greater appreciation of how faith works in our lives, how God can work into our lives, and how the power of believing in a world that can be so skeptical and so suspicious at times of itself and of each other can be overcome. Thank you. That's a tricky one. It is. I think that it comes. If you look at the life of Francis, it is this idea of unity, and it very much in keeping, I think, in sort of the tradition of the church itself. This idea that one fights for unity at all costs, the idea of trying to understand, but it moves beyond again just the human, just unity among human beings. But again, it's how Francis sees creation as brother and sister, how Francis sees this connectedness, this cosmological sort of union between us as human beings. Although, again, we are created sort of last and top of all of that creation is, we can never forget the fact that there is this connection that we have to everything that is around us. So again, that promotes understandings of respect, to learn to appreciate, to learn to know what makes something what it is. So rash judgments wouldn't be a part, or prejudices wouldn't be a part of that. At times, it is the thing where friars. Well, I think that in some ways the world wants. Well, sometimes there's. I guess it's 2 points. There are times in which the world itself, culture itself, while it may not like religious communities and religious things in general, it finds that it needs to have that, and so. But yet it limits the understanding of those religious communities into being something that is totally other than the life that's being led perhaps by the culture. So a community that embraces poverty is sort of this ideal that we want to hold out there because it's different, because it's not what I happen to be and not what I'm called to be or what have you. And so I want to make sure that I maintain that by rather living the vow of poverty for them. That can become very dangerous because what it turns the vow into is sort of an idol. It turns the vow into something that it exists only in opposition to what is. And again, any vows that any religious takes are meant to further their incorporation into the world rather than separate them from it. And so what you get sometimes is, again, so you got the agenda from the culture that says, you Franciscans are supposed to be poor, you have to have money to go to education, to get an education, so you're not going to go for an education. Then you get it within the community itself, with people who have unfortunately maybe experienced the burdens that come with wealth, or the burdens that come with resources and things like that. And so they reject it altogether, and then that rejection again becomes part of their life within the community, which can become a great source of tension. Again, the personal agenda. So you get the cultural agenda and the personal agendas kind of vying within that. The No, well, nobody has actually ever. When I was on interview here last November, I did, because I was eating in alumni dining room over in Slaven, and there was some student who came up to me and said, "What are you?" All right, I'm Franciscan, but. I do get sidelong glances sometimes. In crossing Huxley, cars have not sped up. I've been afraid of that. Cars sped up to hit me. I haven't experienced that. Father Joe Guido was telling me, though, the other day that a student was asking him, so when do you all wear black? Actually, this is not black. This is dark chocolate. But he was asking, a student was asking, when do you wear black? And Father Guido goes in to say, well, when somebody dies or when we're doing something else like this. And so then the student responds with, oh, is that friar who's always in black, is somebody died in his family the whole time? You know, and Father Guido says, no, he's somebody totally different. So it has been interesting. I think that in many ways the students here just seem to go with the flow, which is a wonderful thing. It's not as if the habit is seen as a peculiar, as is seen as something that is strange, and so we'll see as more happens. Okay. Ah, yes. Okay. Yes. Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. The Santa Barbara Mission's got very good men. Very good men out there.
Thank you all for coming.